present and emerging. I would also like to welcome representatives from RA's patrons, Aurecon, Arup, Arcadis, Stantec and SMEC. Today's topic is one we have wanted to host for some time now. The connection between infrastructure and place is obvious in some ways. After all, it is transport infrastructure that connects us to our places. But there is, of course, a lot more complexity to it than simply linking places up. Today's webinar will be hosted by Marco Misco, who will help lead our guest speakers through that complexity. Marco is a partner at HWL Ebsworth and chairs RA's Sustainability Policy Stream. Marco, over to you.
Royce, thank you very, very much. And welcome to everyone, wherever you are around this great nation of ours, to this RA Sustainability Stream webinar. Today, we're looking at infrastructure and place, and what a great topic that is. Royce, as you say, we've been dying to do this for so long, and we have three cracking speakers with three cracking presentations. Our hope, of course, is that the discussion over the next hour will explore the enablement of place and transport infrastructure. It's a rapidly growing area and one where many people are coming to recognise the significance of place in new ways. And it's such a simple concept, place. This needs to happen and it needs to be expressed through good project planning, design and delivery. And an important aspect of this, of course, as always, is delivery by government. We're expecting the speakers today will cover a number of situations that are good examples of this. They'll show where considerations of place have been included in a certain way that gave rise to benefits for stakeholders at that location and probably outside of that location. An example of place-based benefits is something like the $5.8 billion roads of strategic importance. For Rosie, investment is dispersed in accordance with particular project principles. An example of those principles are reforms to support Indigenous employment and engage with Northern Australia stakeholders. Other examples where such principles are taken into account include the Faster Rail initiatives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of the three speakers now, and then I'll throw to each speaker for 10 minutes, after which for each speaker we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A. So let's start with, let's start with Will Fuchs, who is our Urban Places market leader. He's from our webinar sponsor, Stantec. I think it's always important to tell you a little bit about our speakers as well, without traversing and cataloguing an entire CV, but I think it's good to know where our speakers come from and what they're passionate about. So with Will, he has been a vocal public advocate in national media and with city mayors for transport and infrastructure decision-making to consider place by design more holistically. Will has provided advice to all levels of government on how to balance movement, place, and security in working and changing cities. At Stantec, he leads a team that brings place-based strategy to operations across transport, buildings, and community development. So what's Will going to talk about? Will's planning to talk about designing for place, the challenge. He'll consider the journey the profession must undertake to understand the different aspects of place. Those aspects can flow from, say, a city's density, or they might flow from ministers looking for a social community outcome rather than one that's merely around movement of people and goods alone. And I think that's a really important point. Will also intends to explore the relevant hierarchies of priority that apply in this area. Those hierarchies set a tone that flows through projects. The tone is a key factor in how the projects are procured, designed, delivered, and ultimately experienced by customers. Our next speaker is then going to be Carol Vale, who is the CEO of Murruwin. Carol is a Dunghutti woman who has dedicated her 35+ year career to breaking cycles of disadvantage and closing the gap. She has particularly looked to amplify initiatives that contribute to improved futures for Indigenous Australians. Carol founded and continues to run Murruwin Pty Ltd, a national Indigenous consultancy. Carol works across a wide range of social and public policy areas that directly affect Indigenous Australians and communities. And so to our final speaker, Louise McCormick Infrastructure Commissioner of the Northern Territory. Louise also has various roles across organisations such as Austroads, ARB, the Australian Road Research Board, and the Infrastructure Investment Forum, and iBody National Forum. She has over 20 years experience in the transport and infrastructure sectors, and he's also a multi-award winning chartered engineer in both civil and structural engineering. I was very proud to be one of the people in attendance when Louise was the winner this year of our John Shaw Medal, our highest honour. A very, very proud moment. Over the 16 years Louise has worked in the Northern Territory, she has been involved in planning, delivery and management of some of the Territory's largest and most complex infrastructure projects. So I'm very shortly going to hand over to Will. There is, as I said, an opportunity for 5 minutes of questions after each speaker. So make sure you avail yourself of that function. I'll be the facilitator of today's webinar. As I say, I'll introduce the speakers very, very shortly. If you're wishing to lodge a question, it's using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and not the chat function, a mistake that I absolutely would have made. I should just remind you now that at the conclusion of our policy webinar today, you'll receive a survey email. You can choose to answer just one question in the email or click through to a short survey that will help us to continue to select and deliver webinar topics of interest to you, because at the end of the day, that's the importance of these webinars. Okay, well, thank you very much for bearing with me. Without further ado, let's hand over to Will. Thank you, Will.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco, for that introduction. Now I've got a short presentation. So I'm going to talk about designing roads to enable place. And I think the language here is really important because as transport practitioners or road practitioners, part of our job is to enable and not create. And so communities create places, but we're there to enable places. And I think that's a really important distinguish for us as industry to realise that we're there to enable places. So I'll go through my presentation. Next slide. So one of the things is roads have always been places. So we hear about the music of streets and the sort of the language we even use, the flow, the rhythm, the volume. These kind of terms are all associated with movement and associated with a sense of place in this one. And this is in Paris and the Montmartre. And you just have to see the sort of artistic representation of not only the movement but also the place functions. Next slide. In the modern city movement, there was a real intent around the 50s and 60s to separate these two functions out. And Le Corbusier and his City of the Future and a number of architects really saw the automobile and the separation of this, and for good reason, and places in one function and movement was in the other. Next slide. But what this is, the outcome of this is a number of outcomes, and these are pretty well known, but one of the sort of macro outcome is a real intensity of our reliance on cars and a reliance on roads. And this has led to, in this case, a real persistent increase in carbon emission, even so other sectors are flatline or are going down. In the transport, it continues to go up. Next slide, please. And there's also social isolation and fragmentation. When a severance is created by a large infrastructure, which is for one function, often that leads to one group being unable to cross or to use that infrastructure, and that's led to social isolation. And this is depicted by the beautiful the Cahill Expressway in Sydney. Next slide, please. So what is place? And one of the things, my favourite place, or one of my favourite places, is Trafalgar Square in London. And the thing about place is it's not only about the buildings, but it's also about how it makes you feel. Next slide, please. And places, we all know that we've gone to a place such as Trafalgar Square, you go into the library and you see a piece of art that sort of makes you get this sort of sense of place. And that sense of place is something special and something people hold on to, but it's also something unique. And so as designers, or road designers with standard, that's a very hard thing to understand. And so that creates a sense of, interpretation. Next slide, please. But the reality is, Trafalgar Square, it's got a transport function. It's one of the busiest bus streets in the UK. It's got the roads, it's got cyclists, it's got walkers, it's got a movement function. So it's got both movement and place. And a lot of it is about that balancing, and we hear that word, but it's also understanding both movement and place in these important things. Next slide. So we talked to over 200 practitioners across Australia about place, and what we heard was there's distinct categories of people who were seeking to understand place, and we were looking, and I'll just point to one, which is linking place to cause. And this group was effectively a range of different people who are trying to understand place from a certain perspective. So whether that be health or a certain community perspective or a certain angle. So it's cause in terms of that was the origin of looking at it. And the other ones in terms of place proprietary measures, people are looking at place to understand it. You've also got economic and monetary valuation, you've got urban designers, and you've also got transport practitioners. Next slide, please. We concluded across all these 200 people, there's a lot more, I think there's about 240. There is a shared recognition in the transport industry that we have a responsibility to enable places through working with others towards a common aspiration. And I don't think I heard anyone that said we didn't want to accommodate place. We heard a lot of, we don't know what to do, but we heard everyone with an aspiration and an aim to do that. And I think that was one of the probably really positive things that came out of the research. Next slide, please. What we did here was there was a real tension, and this is why you're asking why I showed some art at the start, is the difference was people really had a fear between a prescribed outcome and an organic outcome. And people wanted common language, systematic processes, and clear systems. And that's some people. Other people wanted organic in terms of responsive to local context. They didn't want it to not listen to people, and they wanted those processes. They didn't want the rigid. And that was a real tension that we heard throughout the research. Next slide, please. However, there was a not desired, and I think this was across both audiences, that the challenge of this is there's a lack of clarity if you can only feel a certain aspects of place. If you have a prescribed outcome that's not clear and not common, then it's a forced outcome, and people didn't want that. And so you had this sort of inner tension between these two things where people were wanting to influence each other, but getting through it was a little bit challenging, and there was desired outcomes and not desired outcome. Next slide, please. So in terms of place, in terms of measurement of place, and we, in the research which is available on Ausroads, there is a very clear way to measure place, to understand place, and to go through that process. And there's a whole lot of different ways of approaching that problem, but there are pretty clear steps. And so it's around dwell time, it's around measuring economy and behaviours within the street environment. And so it's relatively forming, and it is locally specific. It does depend on where you are, it does depend on your objectives, and that specificity of local context is something that needs to be adjusted, and a little bit of attention going through the process. But there are absolutely, and probably on a daily basis, value and attention from people to that a business case or a project or any style thing, any investment needs to accommodate place and needs to think about place. The days of not accommodating place have gone, and we're moving into a far more holistic view of our impacts. Next slide, please. But there is a clear challenge for industry. Next diagram, please. So we've got a transport system, and the way that many people manage and operate and design our transport system is based on rules, systems, processes, standards. This is a relatively self-cycling process. So you've got incremental upgrade, you've got guidance, you've got a user base that's relatively established. You've got this status quo, this moves in a circle. And then next part of the slide, please. We then have what sorry, not me, I can give credit to others for this, is this new gen multidisciplinary user who is looking at transport, enabling travel choices, safety, place, all these different aspects. And they're effectively, in many ways, operating outside of this system. Next point, please. And this creates tension because not only are people talking different languages, but they're also asking for different things. Next slide, please. What, does it always, probably disappointment, anger, there's a whole lot of different things that this could result in. But really, it's about the two things being separate. And that's not healthy, because when you're designing for a city and you're designing for a community or you're designing for a transport system, if you have opposition, costs escalate, timelines escalate, the amount of community angst escalates. And so we've known that about engagement for a long time, but actually movement, place, incorporating place is a way to be on the front foot of these things, to understand where you're designing and how to appeal to the communities that you're designing to, or sorry, not appeal, how to design for those communities. Next slide, please. So as a final point, movement of place is policy now. It's policy pretty consistently across the country. It's very different in different jurisdictions. So New South Wales, Victoria, WA, New Zealand, Tasmania, NT and SA all have different frameworks for movement of place. There are similarities there, but that is how they are planning and managing their road network or that is the intent of how they're doing it. And so there is a real need there is a real clear policy that movement of place, and I put it in the place there, is to accommodate in projects going forward, whether they be mega projects or micro projects. It's part of the new BAU or the new business as usual. So that's my close, and that's my final point that I'll lead on. Mark, I'll give it back to you to hand over to our next speakers.
Will, thank you very much. That incredibly interesting topic, and I love the analytical way that you've gone through that. And I have to say thank you very much. Managed to cover all of that in 10 minutes. As a lover of Australian art, and including Jeffrey Smart, it was fantastic the way you incorporated that. And I think it's a great example, because the sense of isolation, well, you get that in all of Jeffrey Smart's artworks, but that one in particular, I think that was an absolutely apposite choice. I think a couple of fantastic concepts there. The concept of dwell time. And it's interesting because if I think of two Australian cities, I think they're a little bit different from others, Sydney and Melbourne, where people do. I think they do have a sense of place in a lot of areas, a lot of suburbs. I mean, you look at Sydney, if you live in the inner east, there is no chance you are going to cross the coat hanger to go and have a coffee or to go and eat or going to do anything on the lower North Shore, unless, in the olden days, you'd go to the Bathers Pavilion or something like that. So, and, similar in Melbourne, but not quite as spectacular. But I think there is, whether for a good or a bad reason, there is that sense of place. Now, it's not up to me to chew up the time of others who want to ask questions, but I don't seem to have any questions on the Q&A function when I look at it. So if anyone does have a question of Will, and I can't believe that you don't, please don't be shy. Oh, here we go. We do. Excellent. Fantastic. So let's have, oh, yes, excellent. Good to see that Anonymous is on the guest list today. They come to actually most RA functions. I don't know what RNA is. In any event, let's get the question here. Queensland was clearly missing in terms of having a strategy or policy. Is there work being undertaken in this space? Over to you, Will.
Yes, is the answer. There's a lot of work being undertaken in exactly that space. So I think they're probably, everyone's on a journey. They're probably, they're on a different stage of the journey. Really, the two jurisdictions, obviously Victoria and New South Wales, but also New Zealand are probably on the forefront of the journey. But yeah, Queensland's coming on strong now. Perth as well. So, and then SA. So everyone's on a journey. But yeah, pretty consistent across the country.
Okay, I'm just seeing. It looked like there was a second question, but I don't think there is. Just while I'm waiting, I've got one. I think you made a really good comment about place, or the sense of place can't be forced, and that's got to make sense, doesn't it? You don't want someone from on high saying, we know, or I know exactly what you want in terms of your sense of place. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you think, and it might differ depending on what the place is and where it is, how you get the sense of place that the people to whom that place is most important to, it will deliver?
Yeah. Well, so I'll use an example. So a specific example, like a nighttime economy. So, and that's probably it's probably an easy example. In the past, we would have designed a road in front of a nighttime economy by looking at peak hour flows. That's convention to look at peak hour flows through a nighttime economy. So the first step, and probably the easiest step, is to actually see how many people are going to the nighttime economy and some of the characteristics of those people. We've all gone past a nightclub at night. Well, I've never been past a nightclub at night, but I assume what happens at a nightclub at night is that there's a queue down the street. And actually, if you look at our road safety incidents, most of them at night, most of them around drunk people, these people are spewing onto the street because there's no footpath for them to queue. And so if you're designing for a place like that, you've got to count them and understand their behaviors and then design for that. And I think that's, it's a very simple example. I think in terms of understanding the community is, part of it, and that's a very simple metrics, and some of these are simple steps, is we can't create community. We can only look to understand it and accommodate it as best as possible. And sometimes a community won't exist, and a place won't exist, but at least you've had a look and tried to understand it where you're designing. But the nighttime, I think that's probably the easiest link to show people what we're talking about.
Well, interesting example, just really quickly on that is, I love Chinese food, and I love Melbourne Chinatown. Melbourne Chinatown's a great example. It essentially, subject to all the laneways, exists up and down Little Bourke Street, and it just works.
Yeah, it's a great example. And there was the recent bike lanes. There was one of the representation from the bike lanes was the Palace Theatres, which run 5 theatres within Melbourne. They're one of Melbourne's biggest attractors. They came out and said in favour of the bike lanes, and they said the biggest benefit of these bike lanes is their improvement to the places in front of our theatres. We're one of the biggest assets, and for them, that was a huge benefit, a huge economic benefit for them. So, and that's the subtlety of place, is understanding what those land uses and how they generate activity.
Yeah, no, thank you. Now we've got 2 more questions, which is great. So Sophie Wallace has asked this, Will. Great point that if the new gen interests aren't incorporated into the process, the tensions will arise. It's a big challenge for road design teams. What has worked well here? Yeah, so look, we hear consistently that conversations and language is an important thing across the two aspects, and that is really important. I think one thing is the new gen users need to understand the traditional users more. I think that's a really important aspect of it. And also I think what we heard of the old gen users is they are looking to understand the new gen users. So if a new gen user is talking to an old gen user, they need to, try to sort of explain where they're coming from rather than try to answer a technical question. And I think it's a subtle difference, but I'll go back to the nighttime economy one. I said we're trying to get these people queuing up to the nightclub safely. Now, I could also go to a road designer and say, I want you to do this lane as 2.4 because I've read 2.4 in some guide of America or wherever it is. It's a very different conversation that we're having then, because someone's telling you an answer based on some guide that is not relevant in their minds. So it's all about explaining from the position of the new gen user about why a certain outcomes. And there's lots of green shoots. There's lots of people doing this, and it's really, if I could draw a washing machine in that picture, I probably would. But yeah, fascinating trade-off. I'd love to explore that, but I won't, because Andrew MacArthur has also asked a question, and this is the last one we'll take for you, Will, is how do you see the here we go. How do you see the requirements of place being incorporated into future infrastructure plans while connecting different levels of government that may be involved? And presumably that could include even some of those city deals, for instance, I would have thought, that involve 2 to 3 tiers of government.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently working on a city deal at the moment, and look, it all goes back to money, and like place will become an important part of not only economic returns, but also making a case of why a certain investment is important. And that'll, once that becomes a criteria in the business case, which it's there and central to the business case, or a successful business case, then it trickles down to everyone, and everyone needs to accommodate. So, but yeah, it's linked into the overall macro picture, and that's why I effectively said on the last slide, every state's doing this. So if you're not starting to do it, you want to think about how you're going to do it, because it's policy and happening.
Excellent. Well, look, Will, thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fascinating, particularly, and you were able to encapsulate that within the short time. So thank you very, very much, and we'll do it. Thank yous at the end again. So in the meantime, I will ask you, Carol, if you could please do your 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have a few minutes of Q&A at the end of that.
Okay, wonderful. And so we've got a slideshow as well there that's going to be brought up. All right, so first of all, let me acknowledge country. Let me pay my respects to Indigenous people where I am in Brisbane here today, in the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I also acknowledge traditional owners and custodians on the lands where all of you are today. My name is Carol Vale. I'm a Dunghutti woman from New South Wales and the head of Murrowan. Murrowan is a consultancy firm that has been working a lot in the whole infrastructure and development space, certainly in New South Wales, in both urban and regional areas, and now starting to work in other areas across the country. So we get to work with those that are working in the context of place, and ensuring that Indigenous perspectives are articulated and made visible in projects. And I'd like to share with you a bit today some of those examples, but also the policy framework that we are working with, in particular within New South Wales. So next slide, please. So that's us. So hello, acknowledgement country. Like I said, I acknowledge country right across Australia. When we speak about country, so next slide, please. Country. When I talk about country is everything. It is you are always on country. Now, a few things in regards to placemaking that I'd like to touch on before we move into the slide. And one is that when we are working with place, there are a couple of key things that are really critical to the integration of Indigenous perspectives into these projects. And it's the notion of place taking, place making, and then place keeping. Place taking is the acknowledgement that these places, colonisation resulted in the notion of places being taken. So the work that you all get to do is contribute to placemaking, and part of the placemaking, the authentic aspects of placemaking is working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that live and work in those areas, but particularly traditional owners, in regards to ensuring that what's important for them in that place, whether it be, the physical, the environmental, the natural, the physical, is that you create ways for that to be captured up and articulated in these projects. That then leads to place keeping. So place taking, place making, place keeping. Place keeping then is about ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are present and visible and able to participate in your projects. I wanted to speak about, this is about, Will spoke a lot about roads there and the transport system. A lot of those roads that are in communities across the country are built on traditional tracks, traditional Indigenous tracks. They are part of, of different song lines. So it's about it's about ensuring that the integration of country is captured in your projects. When we do our work, we speak about a place. We come from a context of developing a place strategy. This place strategy, it's important that it is holistic, that that it is grounded in the first story first, and then all other stories come after that. Critical to that place strategy is the acknowledgement and the recognition that these places, wherever you are in Australia, these places are connected to the oldest living culture in the world. That's an incredible, I guess, cultural and potentially a commercial aspect to these places. And when you're thinking about placemaking, capture that in there. Your placemaking provides an opportunity for Indigenous Australians to become visible in these places. Wherever you are always on country. Then the final bit around, I guess, place is, or one of the many things is that if we talk about place experiences or people experiencing places, and there are a number of, I guess, things that we need to think about, it is always coming from a country-centred perspective. So therefore, it is the traditional, how do you, create opportunities or experience for the traditional owners to experience their traditional lands. Then there's the visitor experience. So those that come and live and work and play in these places. So how do you, create opportunities for them to enjoy and experience place that is country-centred. So when I talk about country, I'm talking about, country, it's an entirety, it's about the individual, it's about the community, it is about the collective. So next slide, please. What I'm going to talk about now is we work across New South Wales, like I just mentioned. I'm actually based in Brisbane, but we work certainly across Brisbane, Queensland and New South Wales. In New South Wales, I have the New South Wales Government Connected with Country framework, which comes out of the New South Wales Government Architect Office. It is in a pilot phase at the moment, but the majority of infrastructure development projects are being encouraged to work with the framework. And I actually think I've got a policy background, and I actually think it's one of the, it's a really good policy framework that can assist the sector to look at integrating Indigenous perspectives into this work. The framework is, it consists of a whole, I guess, range of advice that those in the sector can draw on, and it is a structured way that you can work with to implement your projects. So there are a number of strategies, there are principles of actions, and then there's other things that we'll speak to. But the strategies, there's two or three big strategies. The first one is creating these pathways for connecting. So when you're thinking about your place, I would always encourage, again, it's about working to ensure that Indigenous perspectives are visible. Where you can, I really think it's important to apply language, and even if you use it as placeholders, but start to help to show up us again into this work. It's the second path. There's 4 pathways with this pathway for connecting. Learning from first languages and place names. So if you think about Indigenous places, usually places in Aboriginal language is for purpose. So that can help you to understand how that country was being used in that place. Always important to develop mutually beneficial relationships with country, and so working from a country-centred perspective, it is about reciprocity and building those relationships. So if you work from a country-centred perspective, then you also bring in people, place, and purpose. This again, working with place, it assists to reimagine the cultural landscapes that used to be there, but always finding common ground. Next one, I realise I'm going to move really quickly through these. Next slide, please. Okay. In the Connect with Country framework, there is a whole process there for you to assist, for you to work through with the life cycle and the different aspects to a project. So it asks people to sense country. It asks you to imagine what country was like, prior to development and happening there. Then it asks, see, once you've sensed it, once you've had, you've reimagined it, then it's about asking you to look at your project and design with country, and then enabling caring for country. So the 4 parts there. Next slide, please. The principles for action. The principles for action is talking about, and so I really encourage others to look to what other jurisdictions are doing. So if you don't have something similar like this in your state, then look at this document and see what you can cherry pick for your state. But again, perhaps bring it to the attention of those in your jurisdiction to work with. Fundamental, I think there's about 10 principles for action. Certainly that first one is about respecting the rights of Indigenous people and their cultural. So when they speak about their stories of place, that is their Indigenous cultural intellectual property. It's important that will always remain with Indigenous Australians. So it's about how do you, I guess, be mindful of that, and certainly look at that in your projects. Prioritising Indigenous people's relationship to country and bring that into your projects. There are always cultural protocols for this, for taking these projects and having that opportunity to close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage and looking for opportunities for financial and economic benefits and outcomes for Indigenous Australians. Always looking at the intangible and the intangible and the tangible benefits for integrating country. Now, intangible is about things like language and stories and cultural practices, and that where the tangible is some of those, it's country, it's the things. So bringing all of those things in and bringing them into the projects. The next one, please. So looking for ways to embed intangible and tangible benefits. Many nations, many clan groups. And so understanding that, and that each First Nation people there is a a distinct cultural identity that sits with place. So becoming aware of that and becoming aware of what are the different elements of build capacity where you can, so that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people can certainly and placekeeping of these places. I dropped out there. I'm not sure what happened there. Apologies. Next slide, please. Beyond the framework provides an opportunity for truth-telling. It provides an opportunity for employment and training opportunities to be brought in. Certainly there should always be a governance aspect to these projects. And so how do you enable that to occur? And then always looking for, business and commercial opportunities for Aboriginal people within these projects. There's so much more to speak about it, but I guess those key things about first story first and ensuring that Indigenous Australians are captured within these projects is important. Thank you. Oh dear.
I'm so sorry. I can't believe that after 2.5 years of lockdown that I've done that. I was on mute, but what I was saying, Carol, was that thank you so much for such a powerful presentation. There are some fantastic concepts, policies and actions there, and I really can't wait for that to start coming to the fore. Now, there are some questions, so I will go to those immediately, as much as there's lots I would like to say. So one from Lucy Thompson, who says this: "Hi, Carol. Sometimes songlines are stories and rules about where and how and what you can do as you move from place to place. One school of thought is that songlines are the oldest movement and place policy in the world."
Oh, no.
Does your knowledge and expertise align with this view? If not, how do songlines and movement and place policy? Let me just see.
I can hear you again now. Sorry, people.
Oh, would you like me to repeat that for you, Lucy? Sorry, Lucy. The question is from Lucy. Carol, would you like me to repeat that for you?
Yes, please. Sorry, my I went off mute there. I'm not sure what happened then.
Okay, no, because I think this is a fantastic question
Okay.
from Lucy Thompson. Hi, Carol. Songlines are stories and rules about where and how and what you can do as you move from place to place. One school of thought is that songlines are the oldest movement and place policy in the world. Does your knowledge and expertise align with this view? If not, how do songlines and a movement and place policy align? Great question.
Great question and great proposition, I think, for some government people, those that work in the arena. Songlines absolutely is about, so what comes with songlines is about behaviour. And Will, I know that you spoke about behaviour, in place and things like that before. So what would occur across a songline is the stories would be told at certain places because it was about instructing, behaviour and attitude and responsibility and all of that along these songlines, and they connected across the country. Lucy, your question about, is there, should it be a movement and place policy? So yes, and I would certainly, I think what songlines are fits well with the potential to underpin a movement and policy place. So I think it's really critical to come from a first story, first perspective. Okay.
Now we don't have any other questions, though I'm sure there must be thousands out there. I could talk with you for hours about this.
Yeah.
One thing I just do want to flag is that place-taking proposition for anyone that really wants to see place-taking from a refreshing perspective. You need to read, if you haven't already, Somebody's Land by Adam Goodes and his co-contributors. As some may know, Adam is releasing a series of fantastic children's books, and this was the first of, I think, 5 to 6 that he is releasing. And so Somebody's Land, it in a beautiful way addresses that issue about that incredible issue about terra nullius. How anyone could have thought that, who would know? But definitely worth having a look at that book. And it won Children's Picture Book of the Year last year. Now, I'll just check really quickly whether there are any other questions, but if not, then there might just be. Let me check.
Marco,
Yes,
Marco, while you're checking, can I just say there are a couple of other really good books and resources here. So one is certainly, the Connecting with Country Framework from New South Wales there. There's a book called Our Voices, which is full of architectural stories from Indigenous architects and they talk about different projects there. Certainly Fire Country, that is written by Victor Stephenson, because fire management is certainly part of our work. There's Sandtalk, there's Dark Emu, The Greatest Estate on Earth by Bill Gammage. There's a whole heap of resources out there. If you read those stories, then they can inform your design. There's a great series at the moment out as well, which talks talks about songlines and sky country and things like that, and I can give that information later.
Fantastic. Now, I am going to pay credit to these 2 questions. First one, and we might be just behind the run sheet, but I think it's important. Chloe Robertson, thanks, Carol. What's the best example you've seen of visible Indigenous perspective in projects?
Oh, Chloe, look, there are so many. There are so many projects, and I mean, we have certainly worked with a whole range of different architects and urban planners and designers on a range of projects. But I mean, you've got, oh my goodness, I mean, there's so from the Planning Institute, so PIA at some of their award winners. You have in Victoria, you have the level crossing Indigenous design guidelines, which was a Victorian awardee. In Western Australia, it's called Cart Walk Wangini, and it is some guidelines there that there's a centre there in Perth. Can't think of its name now, but there's some great examples there. In Sydney, in George Street, there you've got some great examples of urban design within buildings. The National Gallery of Australia down there, some great work down there. So there's some good examples there, and I mean, Will, I can certainly give you. I mean, I can certainly pass those information on to you for sure.
Okay, very, very quickly, but I do want to, I just want to flag this question. So a very quick answer from you, and I'll just summarise the question really quickly from Braden Abala. Hi, Carol. How do we hold infrastructure organisations and processes to account? Braden then gives an example. Recently, Parks Australia failed by creating a walk track that encroached on a sacred site. So thoughts very, very quickly on that one.
All right, every project needs to engage with both traditional owners and other and cultural knowledge holders, so that they can input into, have the conversation, and you have it early in the project, not once the project's already started, because they can then always do a walk across country as well as having people in the circle to talk to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a quick answer to that, but I thought it was important to flag it with you. Can I also say thank you so much for an absolutely powerful and relevant and positive presentation. I wish we could discuss each of these for hours, but we can't, unfortunately. So thank you again, Carol. I will now hand over to Louise for your presentation.
Thanks, Marco. And I've got slides as well. I'll just wait for those to... Excellent. So what I'm going to probably summarise some of the thoughts that have happened today is Northern Territory have reshaped our infrastructure planning system and investment system to try and take on board some of the placemaking things that we've already discussed today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So recently, that's my team there with our minister releasing our new infrastructure strategy plan and pipeline in June this year. And we really took a different approach to how we think about growing both our economy and our population in the Northern Territory. You go to the next slide. And this is the framework which we are now adhering to in the Northern Territory, trying to get our foundations right to adopted placemaking approach. Back a slide, please. Thank you. So we have a new strategy, and that really creates the vision and purpose for why government are investing in infrastructure in the Northern Territory. But underneath that sits 3 key documents which my team produced to support that strategy. So in June, we released the plan and the pipeline. And they're essentially a list of projects that will enable growth of the Northern Territory, both economic and population growth, but also a pipeline of projects to get better visibility of what's actually funded projects, both private sector and public sector across the Northern Territory. But what we're undertaking right now is a new infrastructure audit series, which I will talk to a bit further in the presentation. If you go to the next slide, please. So the reason why Infrastructure NT was created, and we're the first infrastructure body for the Northern Territory, is government here has a very, very strong growth agenda. And the reason why that is Northern Territory has a very small population. We have a massive infrastructure deficit, and many people in some of the most remote parts of Australia that we have to service. So the only way we're going to become self-sustaining is to actually grow both our economy and our population. So government's aiming for a $40 billion economy by 2030, and right now we're sitting on about 26 billion. If we go back one, thank you. But as part of that growth agenda, there are 3 key things that Infrastructure NT is really leading the charge on. And one is looking at what industry sectors are really going to grow our economy and subsequently our population. But also, what are the enabling infrastructure ecosystems that are going to support this growth, as well as some cross-cutting objectives in terms of infrastructure investment in the Northern Territory. Next slide. So to that point, government released their strategy and their visions there that you can read on the screen, but it's really about infrastructure investment that supports growth, but also acknowledging that we want to be sustainable and resilient in doing so, and making sure that the quality of life for Territorians is improved by that. And a lot of the closing the gap targets that government at all levels have really relate to the Northern Territory, because we do have 30% of our population is Aboriginal people. To the right there, you'll see I've got a Venn diagram, and we're really thinking about this in a different way. And it goes to the connection of movement in place that was mentioned earlier today, but we're looking at the entire infrastructure system as an ecosystem approach. And to provide growth, you really have to have those three things there that I'd mentioned previously. So the industry sectors, what's enabling infrastructure, and the objectives to get us there. If you go to the next slide. So the cross-cutting objectives that government have released when they're thinking about investing in infrastructure is really, and this may seem very obvious, but it's not always done, is actually investing in the right infrastructure in the right place at the right time, supporting our increased growth, productivity and innovation. But things that came through really strongly from consultation that we did on the ground was improving livability for Territorians, which goes to the place-based approach, as well as embedding sustainability and resilience. If you go to the next slide, please. So we looked at this and all the feedback we got on the ground and have really redesigned our entire system around a place-based approach. And I work very closely with what we call investment territory. So we have an investment and a major projects commissioners who are really there to support private sector investment, but I'm there to balance that with the social needs of Territorians and what that brings with growth, because as anyone that's lived in Northern Australia will understand the growing pains of going from very small communities to large communities in very short space of time. So we look at the investment portfolio of what private sector projects are coming into the Northern Territory and looking at what that enabling infrastructure is going to be, both economic to support the projects and the investment, but also the social infrastructure for people on the ground wanting to live here. That all then flows through into the infrastructure pipeline, and I know topical in infrastructure space is market capacity. So we're trying to map out at a territory level what that pipeline looks like so that industry can plan ahead for their workforce requirements. Next slide, please. So when we looked at that investment portfolio, there was, believe it or not, a $30 billion anticipated investment from private sector into the Northern Territory, and trying to manage that level of investment across some of the most remote parts of Australia is quite a challenge. So we really are doing a lot of demographic work and to unpack how that will fold out across the Northern Territory. Next slide, please. And this is the key slide that I really wanted to talk to in terms of the place-based approach that we've taken. So Infrastructure Australia released their Australian infrastructure plan last year, and one of the 9 reforms that they suggested was actually taking a place-based approach in infrastructure planning and investment. So we've been the first to adopt this out of the infrastructure bodies at jurisdictional level, and we've taken a view of infrastructure at 4 different levels of place. So the first being a national significance approach, where we're trying to signal to the Australian government where infrastructure investment will have a national outcome. So one of those there would be the Beetaloo Basin. So you may have heard of the Beetaloo Basin. It can be quite controversial, but it has a significant and internationally significant amount of gas in that basin. And when there's gas shortages on the eastern coast and southern states, that has potential to solve a national issue. Then we go to a territory-wide approach, and that may be where we've got common issues right across the Northern Territory. So things like education, building upgrades or road corridors, as was mentioned earlier through the road program and Rosie, they are territory-wide significant projects. Then we'll have regional level, so that's more things like regional scale hospitals and education precincts. And then right down into the community level, which is very much feedback from the community in terms of what will improve their everyday lives there. If you go to the next slide. So right now, we're undertaking an infrastructure audit, and this has not been done extensively in the Northern Territory before. And what we're really doing is engaging very broadly with our communities right across the Northern Territory to understand from them what the opportunities and challenges are in achieving that growth vision. And we do have now established in each of our regional centres is regional economic committees, and their remit is really about identifying and advising government what they want from their place, if you like. So they will have a very strong view and about what that place means for them in their region, so that when we bring this audit information into our plan and our pipeline, it really resonates then with the people living in those communities. So I can't stress that enough, how important that is to make sure that they have ownership of this, and that because a place obviously doesn't work if the people that are living there are not enjoying living there in the first place. So it gets through the audit, we're getting a lot of rich information from community and from Aboriginal people, as well as what they want to see as part of that growth, and them driving their own agenda as well. Next slide. I think I'm finished with that, but feel free, there's a lot of detail in that, but happy to have further conversations if people want to get in contact. Thanks.
Louise, thank you so much. That sounds like such an amazingly exciting and worthwhile, game-changing or place-changing initiative. It really does. I cannot wait to see the way that unfolds. So thank you very, very much, again, in such a short space of time, for so beautifully encapsulating that. Now, I've been looking to see whether there are any questions. I don't think that, oh yes, here we go. Excellent, Braden. Thank you for another question. That's great. Thanks, Louise. I see so many stories of Aboriginal people being struck on the roads. What is the NT government doing to ensure the infrastructure meets the needs of the communities that they are supporting?
That's a really great question, and unfortunately that does happen more often than we would like in the Northern Territory. And a lot of it happens when we get remote community people coming into the urban settings where they may not be used to roads that have a lot of cars and faster cars. And there's several things that we have tried over the years. It's still a problem to be completely solved, but a lot of it is around education of both drivers and pedestrians. So we have a Drive Safe remote team that actually goes out into the 73 remote communities to provide road safety and driver education. So we do quite a lot in that space. We've recently also developed road safety applications where they're in language. So I think Carol talked to language before. So Yolngu is one of the bigger ones from Arnhem Land. So I think there's 8 different Aboriginal languages in a road safety app that's being used. The other thing we have tried is when remote community people come into town, most of them love footy, or if they're in Central Australia, they love beanies. So we've been giving out free footy t-shirts that have high vis stripes on them, so that if they are walking at night, in particular, that they're visible, and beanies in South Australia, in southern central Queensland. I'll get it right eventually, Central Australia. But that seems to have helped enormously as well. So that was quite a popular program that worked as well. But if anyone's got any other ideas, I'm happy to hear them as well.
Louise, thank you very much for answering that. Now, I was going to say we're getting very close to time. Can I say, just in terms of roads and communities, having done a number of Red Cross initiatives in communities in Tiwi and on Groot, I know exactly what you're talking about. But gee, in terms of place, though, what magnificent places they are. Okay, well, we are getting very, very close to time, and I am conscious, as Ian Webb always said to me, that we need to facilitate to let people get away to do the rest they need to in their busy lives. What I would like to do is just personally thank all 3 of you. Thank you, Will, Carol and Louise, for absolutely fantastic presentations, particularly in the short time that we've allowed. And I think we could have spent a whole afternoon discussing this, and we all know that. What I would also like to thank our sponsors, Stantec. So thank you very, very much. And what I'm going to do is hand over to Stantec's business leader, Transport, Lynn Trong, to deliver closing remarks from the sponsor. I'll then mention 1 or 2 things really, really quickly, and then I'll leave you to your Friday afternoons.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible session, and it was very, very thought-provoking. You know, Will, you really hit home there when you said to me that us that we're here to enable space, community, place. Communities is what creates space, and that tension and dwell time put me into a mindset of this is a pulse, right? There's a pulse over a day, over a week, over seasons. Then you fold into that what Carol was telling us, that actually it's not just now. This pulse has been living and breathing for millennia, and now we're just the next step in that story. And so that message that we have to get the first story first, that's our starting point. And then we roll into Louise, you know, that journey that we're taking here in the Northern Territory. It's enormous. It's so far reaching, and it's very much the next step in this story of place, and that the gravitas around this opportunity, and to be able to bring the first people into this journey with us is so important. So thank you so much. We're very happy to take this opportunity to make our donation today to the Rumba Ballara footy and netball club, and for all the great work that they do. So thank you very much for the panelists. Thank you, Roads Australia, for the opportunity today, and all the audience that joined us.
Lynn, thank you very much. Thank you for two things, your closing remarks and also your sponsorship. And I couldn't agree with you more. All three speakers taken as a whole, an incredibly powerful message, if not actually emotional and spiritual. So two closing reminders, if I may. Firstly, we've got, as always, a number of outstanding upcoming events. What I'd like to flag just coming up soon, the panel discussions in our upcoming Road Australia freight themed industry lunches. They're going to be held in Sydney on September 20 and in Melbourne, October 11, with great panelists, as we always have, as you can tell from today. So have a look at the details in the events section of the RA website. And then finally, I mentioned it before, I'm just going to remind you about that WAFA fan little survey email that you're going to get. As I said, you can answer one question, we can click and go through. As always, these things help us to keep these events as relevant as possible. Other than that, again, I would like to thank you, Lynn, and the three speakers for fantastic, powerful presentations. Other than that, stay safe, have wonderful weekends, and go Pies on Saturday. Thank you very much.